Hello and welcome to Portland Cocktail Week Distance Learning. It has been a while since we've been on here because we've been doing so much fun stuff in person. But I'm super happy to be back. My name is Brittany Leach Johnson. I work for Portland Cocktail Week and Camp Runamuck. And I am joined today by Cameron George, who is a dear friend of mine, but is also the national ambassador for Ardbeg for the U.S. And today we are having our first class of our second total round, the Scotch Whisky Diploma program, which is a program that I'm very excited that I get to sit through plenty of classes of because I feel like I've picked up so much knowledge from. But in this program, we have 50 students for each go round. So this will be our second. And they get to go through the Edinburgh Whisky Academy Scotch Whisky Diploma program. And that is all brought to us by our dear friends at Ardbeg because classes very intense, very knowledge filled, super fun. But if you're doing it on your own, it can be kind of expensive. So thank you to Ardbeg for providing this education for so many wonderful bartender friends of ours. And in our class today, Cam is he's dedicated this hour to the South Shore of Islay, early distillation, the Kildalton Cross, shipwrecks, and farm life. So we do want to make sure that you're dropping comments, you're asking all of the questions. Usually when Cam talks to me about Scotch, I have to ask plenty of questions. So feel free to get in the comments section and pop in there. Cam's really great at going back and clarifying all of the fun peaty, phenol-y stuff we all want to know about. Before we get started, there are a couple of points of order I'd like to cover. So this class is a part of the second round of the Ardbeg Portland Cocktail Week EWA Scotch Whisky Diploma, but applications are actually open right now for the third round of the program. And those applications will close on August the 30th, and the official programming for that third round will start in September. So if you're loving the classes online, maybe you've gone back and watched some of the classes that were broadcast last year as a part of our first Scotch Whisky Diploma. We encourage you to get your application in. We would love to have you be part of the program. Another couple of things that I'm going to let Cam talk because what he has to say is far more important than what I have to say. If you're a fan of this kind of content, make sure you like us here on Facebook, on our Portland Cocktail Week page or our Camp Runamuck page. We have classes that kind of gear towards both audience, but we usually cross-post them because there's a lot of overlap there. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube, which is youtube.com/PDXCW. You can follow us on Instagram at PDXCW. You can always find out about what's coming up next, whether that is in person or virtual, over on our Instagram page. And once again, make sure you comment below, ask those questions. Tell Cam that he looks great today because he always does. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cam.
Lies. You know, hopping off the red-eye flight is never easy, but I do it for you. I do it for all of the wonderful bartenders who are enrolled in the program. I can't speak highly enough of the job that Lush Life and then also the Edinburgh Whisky Academy have done putting this content together and then also letting us kind of superimpose some Ardbeg on top of the overall program as well. For those of you who are thinking about signing up for the third round, do it. I cannot tell you and I cannot praise this program enough. It's something that I actually sat through before we even started the partnership with the two aforementioned program leaders from Lush Life and EWA as well. For me, as a whiskey enthusiast, as a spirits enthusiast, and just a fan of putting things into my face that will allow us to imbibe just a little bit. You know, in terms of the educational takeaways, this is the top tier, the apex of the educational platforms that are out there and offered, especially in the whiskey space as well. So I'm very excited about this second round that we're on. And dare I say, I'm more excited for the third round as well. So please make sure you get your applications in. That deadline closes on August 30th. But we're not here to talk about deadlines. We're actually here to talk about a little bit more about origins and origin stories as well. So today, as Brittany had mentioned, our conversation is going to be specifically ideating around the South Shore of Islay, the 3 distilleries that now call the South Shore of Islay home, or that island, that place is actually called the Kildalton Coastline. We'll also talk a little bit about the Kildalton Cross as well, and then also how that interacts and informs the way that we make our whiskeys at Ardbeg. So let's go ahead and bring the slides up. We've titled this presentation "Home of the Beast," and above that you'll actually see the Gaelic name, which is also the name of the farm that Ardbeg was actually built on way back in 1815. Spoiler alert, the region of Islay has been notorious for illegal and illicit distillation. The first legalized distillery on Islay, for bonus points, I'll actually allow somebody to drop it in the chat if they feel like winning some kudos bonus points there. But the first legal distillery on Islay actually wasn't on the South Shore. It almost sits smack dab in the middle of the island, in the middle of the region, basically on the western side of the middle of the island. No one's kind of come forward to say it, but the first distillery to become a legitimate and legalized licensed distillery on Islay was actually the iconic Bowmore. But the Ardbeg distillery can actually trace its origins of illegal and illicit distillation way back into about the 1790s, which is quite intriguing to me. There we go, David. After I've said David and Graham, both after I've already said the name of the distillery there, come in with the name of Bowmore. But Ardbeg Distillery actually can trace its lineage and some of its history back to illegal and illicit distilling operations that took place under cover of darkness way back in the 1790s. So if you think about what you would have needed and why an illegal distilling operation would have taken place at nighttime specifically, would be because of the ingredients that you need to make single malt Scotch whiskey. Obviously, being single malt, that is in reference to the distillery of origin, can only come from one distillery, single. Malt means that it needs to be made from malted barley, needs to be the grain source. You also are going to need a little bit of water because you also need to ferment that, and fermentation takes a little bit of water. And then most importantly, the act of distillation. And distillation takes energy, takes inertia to drive and create enough energy to essentially boil and create an amount of reflux and interaction between this, basically causing a phase change of turning something from a liquid into a gas and then allowing it to recondense back into a liquid. So to do that, the heat source would have been fire, right? So most of these stills would have been direct fire stills. And you would have tried to avoid as much of the taxation as possible. So the first taxman wasn't stationed on Islay until about 1814. But that doesn't mean that there weren't excisemen who made the journey over to Islay periodically, usually during the day. So a lot of these distillers that were running illegal and illicit distilling operations essentially would have run their stills at nighttime. So if you were to look especially across the South Shore of the island way back in the 1790s or anytime pre-1814, you would have seen all of these small fires that would have dotted the coastline, and those would have been illegal and illicit distilling operations. And you actually see remnants of that even at Ardbeg Distillery now today as well. If you were to visit Ardbeg, you'll find this wonderful, beautiful pier that actually sits out jutting off of the south shore of the island there. And that would have actually been the homestead and the way that we were able to get both raw ingredients on and off of the island as well. So it's incredibly important there. You see remnants of the illegal and illicit distilling operations all around Islay. In fact, there are actually some caves on the south side of the island that have what they have said are makeshift illegal stills from the 1790s as well, which I find quite interesting. But I was alluding to the name at the top of the screen here. Arnhem Beist is the correct pronunciation in Gaelic here. And that actually quite literally translates to home of the beast. At Ardbeg, we make the most heavily peated whiskeys in regular production. All of our malted barley comes to us peated to a level of 55 to 65 parts per million in terms of its phenolic contents. We're not necessarily here to talk about phenols today, so I'll leave that for another conversation that we'll have in a couple of weeks there. But quite literally, Ardbeg has been named the home of the beast because of the smoky characteristic of the whiskeys that we've always made at the distillery there as well. So who we are, we're not about accepting the status quo. We're for everyone who's interested in big flavors and pushing the boundaries of whiskey making. You know, we've shown this time and time again, of course, by making whiskey that leans very heavily into what we call the peaty paradox, the juxtaposition between soot and fruit, right? You know, the juxtaposition between being heavily, heavily peated, but then also almost a bit ethereal at the exact same time. We've also showcased this by maturing and sending new made distillate up to the International Space Station. We've done this by maturing whiskeys inside of a peat bog, buried inside of a peat bog as well. So Ardbeg has always been about making big flavors, but then not necessarily following and setting its own course and trends. This is one of my favorite visages and photos of the Ardbeg distillery. It shows the primary warehouse, the warehouse that's actually closest to the seashore as well. And you can actually see the sea wall off to the left of the warehouse here. If you were to continue to pan around, you'd actually see that pier that I was actually talking about a little bit as well. And another thing I always love to mention about Ardbeg Distillery, and specifically about the southern shore of the island, the reason that it would have been such a great place for illegal distillers to set up their operations during the night was actually, if you look in front of the warehouse, you can actually see some of these almost like darker black jagged rocks out in the bay here. And that actually would have protected the waterway and protected these illegal distillers from the excisemen who would have seen their fires burning from their essentially burning on the coastline. So the excisemen would have known that there was distillation going there, either that or really just a really badass campfire happening there. But they would have been able to tell that it would have been illegal distilling, and it would have been able to make landfall if it wasn't for these series of jagged rocks that actually sit out right in front of the Ardbeg distillery. And in an instance of marrying, you know, microflora and fauna, geography, geology, and then also some of the animal life that lives on the island as well, those same exact rocks are actually used by a lot of deer on the island that will actually go and sunbathe during the summertime, in the summer months, out on those rocks. And if you're ever out on Isla, please let me know, because I would love to host you at Ardbeg Distillery. One of my favorite things that we do is we hire a gentleman by the name of Gus. And Gus is just a total badass. We love Gus. He comes by the distillery on his boat and he'll pick us up. He'll actually take us out of the bay and out onto the water. And you'll get a look at some of the distilleries from essentially from off the coastline. Right next door to Ardbeg are the two iconic distilleries, Lagavulin and Laphroaig. Lagavulin is about a 10-minute walk away from Ardbeg, and Laphroaig is about another 10 minutes after that. So the distilleries are actually quite close in proximity to each other. But Gus will actually take us up and down the coastline, and one of the things he does is he actually will jump off the boat in his wetsuit, dive down into the water, and he'll come back with urchin. He'll come back with scallops. He'll come back with oysters. He'll come back with langoustine and crab as well. And we'll just have a little bit of a barbecue right there on the boat as well there, right? So Ardbeg, one of the things that makes the distillery incredibly iconic is this roller coaster of a history that we've been on. And in fact, we've actually named a whiskey that we released in the early 2000s, actually named it Roller Coaster, to kind of pay homage to the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows of the Scottish whiskey distilling institution, as well as the distillery itself, right? So Ardbeg, tracing its lineage back to 1790s, but officially 1815, Alexander McDougall was actually the gentleman who came in and established the distillery. By the 1850s, Ardbeg was actually the largest distillery on the island. By the 1870s, there would have been about 26 distilleries on the island. Now there's actually only 9 operating distilleries. Number 10 and 11 are actually on the way right now. So Ardbeg surviving and thriving through the 1850s, through the 1870s, all the way up until some brief closures for the world wars, both 1 and 2, as well as the massive boom in the 1950s, 60s, and into part of the 70s, but then total closures from 1980 to 1997, give or take a couple of years there. If you get me on the side, and we have a couple of drams together, I'll tell you a couple of stories about how our good friends on the island have actually contributed to saving Ardbeg Distillery. But that's another story for another day there. Yes,
Cam,
Brittany.
just popping in real quick before we move on, because I don't want it to get lost. Other than a few marriage proposals for you, which I'll let you look at on your own time and decide what you want to do with. The one question we have is, how do you spell Alexander's last name?
Oh, yeah. So Alexander McDougall. So McDougall is MacDouGall. McDougall. And I'll make sure that I'll pop that in the chat here. There we are. McDougall. There we are. Right. So the McDougall family actually has been quite involved at Ardbeg for a number of years. It was Alexander and then John McDougall, and then Flora and Margaret McDougall as well, who were a pair of sisters that ended up running the distillery as well. And then the distillery kind of fell under the tutelage of a gentleman by the name of Colin Hay in the 1860s. So odd right there. He was actually a distillery manager that took on an ownership or an equity share in operating the distillery as well. Quite an interesting gentleman, and for all intents and purposes, from what we've been able to discern from the records, a really, really accomplished distiller whose talents were quite sought after. He was oftentimes courted to leave Ardbeg, but was an Ardbegian, as we say, through and through. And so he stuck it out with the distillery, shepherding it through what would be some of the best times at Ardbeg. The 1850s all the way through the 1870s were some of the best times at the distillery. Obviously, the antithesis to that would be the closures of the 1980s and the 1990s. We almost genuinely lost Ardbeg. The distillery was set to be mothballed in 1997, was set to be demolished in 1997. But thankfully, our wonderful friends over at Glenmorangie Company ended up coming back and saving the distillery.
I'm popping in. We have a couple of questions that we're going to save to the end because I think some of them are larger kind of topics. But can you repeat the name of the person you were just talking about for our friends?
Colin Hay. Colin Hay. Yeah. There have been quite a few Collins in Ardbeg's history. Actually, even now, our distillery manager is a gentleman by the name of Colin Gordon, a very talented Colin as well. I would say that there are a couple of recurring names, the name of Colin, and then the first name of Hamish as well. Hamish Toreg is another very famous, whiskey marketeer. And then actually in the 1960s, Ardbeg was run by a gentleman whose first name was Hamish as well. He was the distillery manager. He came to the distillery from DDL. If we have any rum nerds in the chat here as well, Diamond Distiller Limited, which is actually in Guyana. So he was a rum distiller that came back to Islay to run Ardbeg. So just another little tidbit of information there. Right. So the reason that I've included this, and for those of you on the course, over the next couple of weeks, we will discuss at length the first 3 whiskeys. Actually, we discussed the second one in the lineup yesterday, which was Ardbeg 10-year-old. Next week, we'll be enjoying Ardbeg Wee Beastie, and I hope that you can kind of make the mental leap there that, Ardbeg, the farm that Ardbeg was built on, Arnhem based, home of the beast, Ardbeg Wee Beastie being the youngest and weest of the beasts that we make at Ardbeg. And then the third whiskey that we'll wrap our tastings up with is going to be Ardbeg Anno. We also make a couple of other whiskeys called Ardbeg Ugadal and one called Ardbeg Corey Vrecken. And the reason that I've included this slide is because at Ardbeg, most of our whiskeys, other than the 10-year-old, which is the house style and kind of contains the DNA of the distillery, the other whiskeys take influence and take umbrage in storytelling from the region that is Islay. Right. So with Wee Beastie obviously being named or paying homage to the farm that Ardbeg is built, that Ardbeg is built on. Right. With something like Ardbeg Anno, it quite literally is actually named after the Mull of O, or the Round as it's called in Gaelic. The Mull of O is a small peninsula right off of the southwest coast of the island as well. It basically protects Port Ellen, which is the second largest township, from what would be some pretty intense sea swells and pretty intense waves as well there. Ardbeg Ugadal is named after our water source, and Ardbeg Corey Vrecken is named after a Danish prince who will actually, or a Scandinavian prince who I'll tell the story of a little bit later there as well. So our place in the whiskey world, if we are looking at the UK here, we've got Scotland up toward the farther north end of the map here, just off of the southwest coast of Scotland. You'll find a string of islands called the Heberdeen Islands. And Islay is what's known as the queen of the Heberdeen Islands. It's not the smallest, it's not the largest, it's not the most remote, it's not the least remote. It is one of the more heavily populated. If you are walking around in, say, downtown New York City or downtown Chicago or LA or any metropolitan, destination, and you look up into a skyscraper, chances are that there are more people in that building than there are on the entire island of Islay. Right now, there are about 3,200 full-time residents of the island of Islay. It's quite interesting. They do this thing called the Isla Wave, where when you're driving past each other on these small, almost one-lane roads, of course, you get out of the way of each other, but you raise one hand up off of the steering wheel as if to say hi and to acknowledge, the people who are passing you, because they quite literally are your neighbors. When I stay on Islay for a week, 2 weeks, the longest I've stayed is actually for almost a month. And you really do become part of this community, right? And you become part of this network, this group of individuals that, yes, are incredibly highly spirited, have their own beliefs, but then also more than anything else, take care of one another. And that's something that I see echoed in the bar and restaurant industry as well. Coming off of the back of Tales of the Cocktail, many of you were there over the last week. I can't tell you how many hugs, high fives, and check-ins that I was privy to because of being part of the community, and it's almost a one-for-one in terms of the synergies there that you experience when you're on Islay as well. So we'll enhance that as well, so you can get a little bit of a better look at the island as well. I've always said that Islay reminds me almost of a witch who's kind of riding a broomstick. If you look up north here, you'll find basically almost like a pointed hat, her scraggly long chin, maybe her hands off the left of the word Islay here, a humped back as well at the north side of the island, basically almost just past where you can see she comes very close to the island of Jura. And then down by the south side of the island here, the southwestern side, these would be her little feet that are kind of wrapped around a broomstick. That's actually the Mull of O, or as it's called, the Round. Ardbeg Distillery here. Obviously, I had mentioned that Lagavulin and Laphroaig are our two next door neighbors. There's a fourth distillery that will be gracing, that exact same road as well. And that distillery is actually owned, or will be owned, by a gentleman named Sekinder. Sukhinder Singh, who actually owns or owned the Whisky Exchange, a very famous whiskey purveying website as well. And they do have a brick and mortar. If you're ever in London, go check out the Whisky Exchange. It's one of my favorite places, right? And then also Port Ellen malting facility is basically tucked back up in this bay right here. I don't know if you can actually see my mouse, but the bay that would be Port Ellen, or the port that's Port Ellen, is tucked up right in between the Mull of O and then where you would actually see that still that represents Ardbeg Distillery. And this is another really beautiful kind of shot, and it shows you some of those low-laying, like black and jagged rocks that kind of salt and pepper the coastline there, effectively protecting the region from what would have been very greedy excisemen. Nobody wants to pay taxes unless they absolutely have to there. And actually, this large outcropping of rocks back here, this is actually sits right in front of the cave that I mentioned, was actually an old illicit distiller's cave where they've actually placed an old still back in there. They know that there was illegal distillation happening back there way even before Ardbeg started illegally distilling in the 1790s. It actually dates back until about the 1760s. They've actually had record of some illegal distilling happening back there as well. Right. So what would have made Islay such a hotbed in terms of distilling and distilling provenance? Again, remember, it's the queen of the Heberdeen Islands, but not because it's the smallest or largest. It's actually the proximity to mainland Scotland, as well as the proximity to Ireland, or North Ireland. One of my favorite days, and if you were to look at my passport, you would not see a stamp saying that I've been to Ireland. And I should probably not be admitting this on a recorded platform here. But one of my favorite days was actually taking a boat, not Gus's boat, a different boat from an unnamed Elik, is what you call people who live on Islay, are Eliks. An unnamed Elik and I ended up going over to have some wonderful frothy pints over in North Ireland one day. It was about an hour to an hour and a half boat ride all the way over there. But its proximity to North Ireland is about 45 miles, and then it's about 42 miles over to a port called Kinnacraig, which is actually basically right down next to Campbelltown. And it's the easiest way to get on and off of Islay if you're not actually going to fly, is to take the Kinnacraig ferry. So its proximity to both mainland Scotland as well as Ireland would have actually made Islay more than likely the very first stronghold or place of distillation for Scotch whiskey, aquavite, or spirit distillation in Scotland, if you want to call it that as well. Because as we know, our wonderful, purveyor of so much knowledge, Vic Cameron, who's done such a great job with our bartenders so far, and will continue to blow your brains over the next couple of weeks. As he mentioned, we know that distillation, or knowledge of distillation, came into Scotland via two very different routes. One from the Moors, and then the other route was actually through from and through North Ireland by the monks, effectively. So that route would have taken it directly onto Islay, which would have then passed it potentially into Jura, or maybe even over into some of the other Heberdeen Islands before making landfall in mainland Scotland. So that's why historically Islay is such a revered and important place for Scotch whiskey distillation. It's the home of heavily peated whiskeys, but it's also the home of what would be some of the very first illegal or illicit or untaxed distillation sites in Scotland as well there. Hoping I haven't lost anybody, but maybe we have a couple of questions. Brittany, please stop me if there are any other questions that start to come into the chat there.
We do have some. A lot of them are about Ardbeg products specifically. So if you want to do those now, we can, or we can save them to the end. Whatever is good for you. I don't want to mess up the flow because I'm learning so much.
Absolutely, not a problem. How about I take one now, and then we'll take another one a little bit later.
Love that. So How many current Ardbeg expressions are available in the United States? The person who asked this question said that they can access 4 through off-premise in their home state, but wondering if there's anything extra that they just might not be able to get their hands on where they live.
Absolutely. Yeah. So as I had mentioned, Ardbeg has a flair for the dramatic and really loves to dive into experimentation. And that is singularly because of the gentleman who's at the top of the totem pole for the Glenmorangie distilling operations, both at Glenmorangie and Ardbeg Distillery, Dr. Bill Lumsden, who is the 5-time World Whiskey Distiller of the Year. Nobody else has won that award more than twice. Dr. Bill has an immense love of experimentation. He will try something once, and then he probably won't repeat that experiment. So with Ardbeg, our core range consists of 5 whiskeys. Ardbeg 10-year-old being the iconic, kind of thumbprint of the distillery. Ardbeg Wee Beastie being our newest release in terms of the core range. Ardbeg Anno, Ardbeg, Ugadal, and Corey Vrecken make up all 5 of our core range. We do also have a couple of extended maturation products, is what I'll refer to them as. There's the Ardbeg 19 years old, which is called Trevan, which means singing sands, if you can believe it. Isla is actually the beneficiary of some interesting kind of Gulf trade winds that come from the Gulf of Mexico. So there are actually, during the summer months, it can be quite rainy and also quite humid, resembling a lot of Central America, not necessarily one for one in terms of the heat or the atmospheric pressure at all either. But there are actually some white sand beaches, and the Trevan Beach is this white sand beach on Isla. Then there's also Ardbeg 25-year-old as well, which is the oldest age statemented whiskey that we regularly make at Ardbeg. It is not a part of our core range as we refer to it. It is a reoccurring one-off release. So we will release one batch of Ardbeg 25-year each year. And then on top of that, around June 1st, you can always expect Ardbeg to put out a limited release that delves into something a bit stranger. So a couple of years ago, it was Ardbeg Black that was aged in Pinot Noir casks. This year, it's a whiskey called Ardbeg Ardcore, which is some of the malted barley has been roasted similarly to like coffee beans, basically creating and amplified what you would call like the Maillard effect. Whenever you bronze or like you toast, you see that almost like not necessarily a burning, but it is kind of a burning of like wood sugars, more or less, or burning of sugars in toast. The same thing can actually be applied to when you're actually roasting barley as well. So we've taken some of that malted barley and we've roasted it almost to within an inch of its life, and it's created this chocolatey and metallic kind of flavor profile. It is one of the weirdest and coolest whiskeys I've ever tried from Ardbeg. But watch that space, because we will have 2 product releases to end the year this year as well, which my lips have to be a bit sealed on.
He won't even tell me, so good luck for the rest of you. But I can attest that the Ardcore is delicious. So if you run into it somewhere and you're able, drink it, because it's very good. And Cam, why is it that you all do a release of something a little wackier on June 1st every year?
Yeah, absolutely. So that very first week of June, the last week of May, first week of June is generally what's called Fèis, which is a celebration of all things Isla. It is not a celebration of only whiskey. I can tell you there is so much more to the people and the region than only limiting it to their contributions to the whiskey world. As well, right? So it's a celebration of the culture, the history, the heritage of what is some of the oldest and original settlements in the UK. I mean, life on Isla dates back to about, about 8,000 BC, right? So it is almost a prehistoric land there as well. So that week of Feish is a celebration of all things Isla. That festival ends on a day that's actually called Ardbeg Day. And so for Ardbeg Day, we do a one-off release. And then there's usually something strange that you can buy at the distillery as well, in addition to that. So this year, it was Ardbeg Ardcore was the whiskey that we put together in honor of Ardbeg Day. And then at the distillery, as a distillery-only item, they released something that was super cool. That was a single barrel of Ardbeg aged in black sherry casks. I believe there were like 300 bottles available. I did manage to snag one, so hopefully we can open that together one of these days there, Brittany.
I would love to. Also, I hope that all of you, now that if you weren't aware before, now that you are aware, there is in fact an Ardbeg Day that people celebrate around the world. Start celebrating, because what better to celebrate than Ardbeg? And also, I think I know where I'm going to start spending the first week of June, because like there's not really anything going on here. So we do have some more questions coming in, and there are actually some really, really good. All the questions so far have been great, but I think it's probably going to be best to hold those to the end because they're a little bit more involved. But two quick ones before we move on, because I want to make sure we cover all the material, is when you were talking about the distance between Ireland and Isla, Sophia, sweet Sophia, who's
American
American miles or European.
I already knew where that question was going as soon as you said it, and then you popped it up. American miles.
And then we have a question of how do you spell Feish so that they can look it up, incorporate, celebrate.
Absolutely. Yeah, not a problem. So it is Feis.
There you go. I wouldn't have guessed it. So thank God for you. So we do have some more questions coming in. They're all really wonderful, but I do want to make sure that we got through everything that Cam prepared because it's all very interesting. So let's get through that and we'll come back to questions at the end. I also know if there is a question that we don't get to and you are one of the 50 students, for some reason, like time-wise, we aren't able to get to it, we can also address it in a drop-in dram. I prefer to do it here for everybody who's not a part of this particular session of the Whiskey Diploma, just so everybody gets to hear. But if you're one of the 50 and we somehow don't make your question, we can talk about it in our next drop-in dram. So with that, Cam, I know we've got more slides.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just to piggyback on that last question as well, it's Feis and then Ile. So Feish Ile, I-L-E, Feish Ile. Is the name of the actual festival, and it is a very, very good time. If you actually would like to see a little bit of what we did for Ardbeg Day this year, you can actually go to Ardbeg's YouTube page. So just go to YouTube and type in Ardbeg and find our page. And we've left the entire series of recordings and activations and events that we did on Ardbeg Day up there. I did a wonderful, little punk rock cocktail seminar with Dr. Bill and my boss, David Blackmore, as well, which was a lot of fun. There were tastings with Colin Gordon, Jackie, who is the distillery's, basically she's more or less mom at the distillery. She is like master of ceremony for everything as well. She's just an absolute gem. The distillery doesn't run without her. And she was actually the first person that ever took me around the distillery. And I'll tell you a very funny story about that one day if we get the time as well. So, as I had mentioned, Islay is quite an ancient place. A lot of the history and a lot of the life actually dates back to the Mesolithic era. Even before 8,000 BC, its first inhabitants would have been about 10 to 25,000 years, 10 to 15,000 years before that as well. Islay was originally formed as part of the Dalriada, which was a kingdom that existed within the Greater Gallic Kingdom in the 6th century AD. And one of the oldest landmarks on Islay is actually the Kildalton Cross, which I'll show you in a second. But on this slide right here, we actually have the ruins of a place that's incredibly powerful. You can feel almost this reverberation of just like power and it's tangibly just tied to the people that live there even now currently. But this ruins that you're looking at on the screen is actually something that is called the Finlagen. And so Finlagen was actually the high seat of power for the Lords of the Isles. So the descendants of a warrior by the name of Somerled, who actually fought to take back the region effectively from some of the Danish folk who were the Danish folk who were actually in the Scandinavians who actually had taken over Islay and some of the other Heberdeen Islands as well there. So the high seat of power for them became this almost like a turducken. It was a castle on an island inside of a lake that's in an island, right? So the Finlagen is actually basically it was almost a fortress, and you can actually explore and see the ruins even now today. And so this is a photo that we took of the ruins a couple of years ago. And I had also mentioned one of the earliest Pictish or Gallic crosses as well to ever be erected. This is a night shot of the Kildalton Cross. So this is completely hand carved and hand chiseled in about 600 AD. Making it one of the oldest Celtic crosses, one of the oldest Celtic or Gallic crosses on the planet still today. And it stands very proudly at the end of the road, basically 10 minutes past Ardbeg Distillery. You'll actually come to the Church of Kildalton, which is where a lot of the very famed members of what is arguably the most iconic of the old world Scottish clans, the Campbells, the clan Campbell. A lot of them are actually buried at the Kildalton Church, and you can see their headstones popping up amongst the grass right around the cross here as well. This is one of my favorite things to visit anytime we're out on Islay. Again, another one of those elements that tethers you directly back to the culture, but then also that you can feel an energy emanating from it as well. It's almost unlike anything else I've seen in my life. Right. So I had mentioned that that Islay fell under Norse rule after the arrival of the Vikings in about 900 AD, almost a couple of hundred years after the cross was erected. The Vikings actually changed the history of the region quite almost basically forever. The island remained under Norse rule for a couple hundred years, at which point the iconic warrior named Somerled ended up fighting the Norse for power again. And this separation, while it was quite violent, the region was returned back to Scotland and back to Gallic rule. But the Norse and the Scandinavians actually still frequented the region quite readily as well. In fact, we actually have a whiskey that tells the story of this, and that whiskey's name is actually Ardbeg Corryvreckan. And the story of Corryvreckan is quite an interesting one. So legend and rumor and myth and lore has it that there was a Norse prince who was visiting Islay well after it had been returned back to Scottish rule. And he was visiting the Finlagen, which was the high seat of power for the Lords of the Isles. And he met the daughter of the Lord of the Isles. And he was so taken with her beauty, her splendor, her grandeur, whatever you want to call it. She was just really, really good looking that he said, I am going to marry her. And so he asked her father for her hand in marriage almost immediately. And her dad, like any discerning father should and did, said, whoa, pump your brakes here. I'm going to need you to prove your worth for my daughter's hand in marriage. So he set him a task, which was to stay 3 nights in a whirlpool This whirlpool, or this maelstrom as it's called actually, is the second or third largest whirlpool on the planet, depending who you ask. Its name at the time would have been the Corrie. Right, the prince's name is Prince Vrecken. You're putting those two things together, so we should be able to take an educated guess at how the story ends up. But I'll tell it to you anyway. So Prince Vrecken ends up accepting the challenge, and he says, "Well, I'm going to need to return home to get my supplies, to get food." And obviously, because he's a mother's boy, he wanted to kiss his mom goodbye one last time. So he returns home, and he has 3 ropes that are made for him. One that is made of tarry leather, one that is made of hemp, and another one that is made of essentially of the finest virgin or maiden's hair. Right. So he returns back to Isla. Terrible dog owner, legend has it as well, because he brought his dog with him. So he returns back to Isla, and he decides to stay 3 nights in the whirlpool. So the very first night, he drops the rope that's effectively made of tarry rope and leather. And there's a goddess who calls the whirlpool home. And so she looks up and she says, "Well, wow, what an absolutely stunning, very handsome individual. Probably had long locks, much like myself." Let me not get sidetracked. Anyway, so she says, I need to keep him for myself." So as soon as he drops the anchor, she grabs the rope and she pulls and she pulls and she pulls. And just before daybreak, or just after daybreak, rather, the rope snaps, but Prince Vrecken survives. Night number 2, he drops the rope that's made of hemp. And the goddess of the whirlpool says, tonight's the night that I make him mine. And so she pulls at the rope, she pulls and she pulls and she pulls. And just after daybreak, the rope snaps, but he survives. And on night number 3, Prince Vrecken drops the rope that's made of the finest and purest maiden's hair. And the goddess of the whirlpool pulls and she pulls and she pulls. And this time, just before daybreak, one single strand of hair gives way and ends up breaking. And then the entire rope ends up unraveling. And Prince Vrecken ends up being dragged to a very, very watery grave and watery demise. Hence, the name of the whirlpool is now no longer just the Corrie. It's actually the Corrie Vrecken whirlpool. So we describe Ardbeg Corrie Vrecken as a whirlpool of powerful and intense flavor. Bottled at 57.1% alcohol by volume. This is a cask strength whiskey coming from Ardbeg. It is ex-bourbon cask that meets whiskey that's been wholly matured in French or European oak, giving it a very peppery and very salty, briny kind of flavor profile and disposition as well there. The call out of that story that I always love to make is that really we're going to blame the death of this Danish prince on one woman whose hair was not of the virtue that he expected it to be. Well, no, you were the guy who decided to go spend 3 nights in a whirlpool. You play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. So congratulations, Prince Vrecken. But thank you for birthing the wonderful and iconic Ardbeg Corrie Vrecken back to us. So this is another instance of how Ardbeg Distillery takes inspiration from the nature around the distillery, around the island, and also the stories of the people that have lived on the island for thousands of years as well. One of my favorite things about Ardbeg is how we infuse the stories of the people and the place back into the whiskeys that we make there as well. Another instance of this is actually by naming one of our whiskeys after the water source at Ardbeg, which is called Loch Ugadal, or dark and mysterious place. In terms of coloration, Ugadal is actually almost a little bit lighter than the water that we actually receive from the loch in and of itself. The water falls basically ambitropically, so it's rainwater that falls down onto, I can't really call them mountains, so call them foothills that are more inland on the island. And those foothills are actually made of quartz. And so they're not easily permeated by water. So you don't actually have a lot of like calcium, magnesium, and mineral deposits that would find their way into the water. Our water source sits in the middle of a peat bog. Peat is quite acidic, as it's actually a carbon sink and one of the best carbon sinks on the planet. So the water source at Ardbeg is what you would actually call a soft water source, as opposed to our friends at like Glenmorangie or Highland Park or any distillery that takes water source that has lots of calcium, magnesium, and other mineral deposits would actually be called a hard water source. So at Ardbeg, soft water source that is very, very acidic as well. And then one of my favorite things and one of my favorite stories of the Ardbeg distillery as well is a whiskey that we call Ardbeg Anno. And if you're practicing your Gaelic or Gaelic a little bit at home, it is not I know, it's not Anoa, Anon, Anoe. It's like saying I know, but with a little bit of brogue to it. Anno, Anno. So this whiskey actually means the round in Gaelic as well, and that's actually a shot of the mull of O, basically from the base of it. So the mull was actually one of the most densely populated areas on Islay until about the 1830s, 1840s, when the Highland clearances ended up making their way to the Heberdeen Islands as well. And if you're not familiar with the Highland clearances, maybe that's a class, Brittany, that we should run during the third round of the academy as well. Is to tell the story of the Highland clearances, which were effectively the forced evictions of a lot of the people who actually made their homesteads on Islay and throughout the rest of the Highland region as well. A lot of these people were forced off of their lands and needed to seek new homes. And a lot of them actually ended up moving down into like Kentucky, Tennessee, as well as North and South Carolina, and also up in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia as well. So Nova, New Scotland, Newfoundland, Newfoundland as well. And then you'll also see a lot of Scots or expats who have made their homes in North Carolina, which is a state that I'm very lucky to get to visit quite often as well. So the story of the Mull of O is very important to the region as well, because the Mull of O effectively protects the south side of the island from what would be immense sea swells. There have been a little over 26 shipwrecks off of the coast of Islay alone. The two worst tragedies actually happening at the Mull of O itself, and those two tragedies actually included American ships. And which is why at the top of the Mull of O, which this image actually shows, there is a monument that is called the American Monument that was erected in 1920 by the American Red Cross and dedicated to commemorate the lives of two separate marine disasters, one of which was actually a naval ship that was torpedoed off of the coast of the Mull back in 1918, and then the other one, which was an American steamship that actually ran into a British steamliner, basically causing mass loss of life and catastrophe off of the coast of the O as well. So the Mull of O, if you're ever able to make the hike up there, it is quite windy. For somebody like me who's very afraid of heights, I never get very close to the edge because it is, about a 150 to 250 foot drop all the way down to the water there. But the American Monument is absolutely glorious, and there's an immense amount of history between how Islay and the Ilex have tried to save so many American lives. Obviously, a lot of them were unsuccessful at doing so, which is why we ended up erecting the monuments there as well. Brittany, before I close out with our last couple slides, do we have any other questions that may be relevant here?
We have a couple for now. I think some of them we're still going to try to save to the end because I think, especially one, you're going to have a lot to say about. Okay. But Joe Bennett wants to know, and I agree, did the dog survive?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, I totally forgot to finish the story there, actually. So legend has it that the dog actually recovered his body and he was actually able to receive the classic Viking funeral upon being shipped home. But yes, he brought his dog and his dog was able to recover his body. And the dog did survive.
Honestly, sometimes you lose a Nordic prince, whatever. But as long as the dog survives, we're good.
Exactly.
And before I want to go into the next question that we're going to cover here. We're going to talk a little bit about those U.S. Ardbeg Day celebrations towards the end, Leo and Madrina. But I would like to remind all of you that are watching, especially those of you that are in this current round of certification or who are applying for the next round of the Whisky Diploma certification. We have an entire series from the last one of completely different classes from CAM and also the global Ardbeg and Glenmorangie Ambassador David Blackmore, who you will see later in this program. But there are so many little instances during the classes they did last year where they go really deep into some of the lore and legend of Isla and of Ardbeg. And there's one class particularly that focuses on that. So if that's something you're excited about and you're interested in, you can definitely go back and check those out if you have not got your fill of Isla lore today. And then Graham wants to know that if, as a part of the next series, if you do a class on the Highland clearances, can he sit in on that class? And the great news is yes, because that will be right here on the Portland Cocktail Week Facebook/YouTube page. So you can watch it while it's happening, or you can go back and watch it whenever you want to. So you'll see somewhere on our Instagram that whenever that is coming up. I don't know which one of the 4 from the next round it'll be, but you can check it out on Instagram, figure out when that's coming up, set yourself a little reminder. And then Janae wants to clarify, is it the mull of O?
Yes, the mull of O. Yep, the mull of O.
Perfect. Hi, Kyle. I have your question about Bardstown bourbon. We're going to save that for the end. And Cam, thank you so much for clarifying the NO pronunciation. It only took me a year of us working together to get
I hear it just, I don't think I've ever heard 4 letters be more mispronounced, but I'll give everybody a little bit of credit there. It is Gaelic. Again, to throw a little bit of traffic to the Ardbeg YouTube page as well. There's a really cute video of up on our YouTube page when we announced that we were putting a new whiskey out back in 2018 is when we released Ardbeg NO. And it is just an adorable video of some Elix basically saying, Ardbeg's got a new whiskey. I know. Yeah, like, have you heard Ardbeg's got a new
I've seen that, and it's really cute. I do highly suggest watching it. All right, well, Cam, let's go through these last few slides, and then we'll get into these kind of longer, a little more complex questions for the end, so that way we can make sure all of our folks who are getting certified, if they have to run to work, they can get through the rest of this content, and then we'll get into some of those questions. But do remember, if you have to dip out to go to work, you can always come back and watch the rest of this later, because it's going to live here forever.
Absolutely. And Graham had asked something about the Highland clearances as well. In a weird way, the 50 students who are in the course already have started to learn a little bit about some of the precursors to the Highland clearances, specifically the Act of Unions, the Union of Crowns in 1707, that date, incredibly important. As King James, what would have been King James VI, was the gentleman who unified the crowns there. There's some interesting, I would call them reverberations that happen, or echoes that happen, or you could even call them like waves, ripples even, that happen because of that union, and that act in 1707 set the precedence for a lot of what we know of the Highland clearances through the 1810 all the way through 1840s. But we'll get back to that. We'll get back to that at another time there as well. Super nerd moment. Right. So now I'm going to take us back to another view of the Ardbeg distillery as we start to kind of tie all the threads back together here. So this is the most up-to-date view of the distillery now. So you've seen it you've seen the distillery from the water. You've now also seen the distillery effectively from what would have been the farm. Ardbeg has now, because of the success over the last 25 years since we saved the distillery. We are now in a renaissance period for the Ardbeg distillery. I had mentioned this, this roller coaster of trials, tribulations, massive successes, and then also sleepier times at Ardbeg, if we want to call them those as well. But because of the interest of like-minded bartenders and then also Ardbegians around the world as well, we've actually now expanded the distillery. So the footprint of the distillery is quite a bit larger than it was even 5 years ago. But it's still actually significantly smaller than it would have been way back in 1815. I've tried to find images of the distillery from the from the 1860s, 1870s. What we do know is that around 1815 to about 1840, there would have been about 3,000 people living around Ardbeg distillery by itself. So there would have been massive amounts of housing. There was actually a school that had enough seating for about 150 pupils as well, and students. So Ardbeg would have been a thriving metropolis in and of itself. I'll use air quotes there. Thriving metropolis in and of itself. So now Ardbeg has had this return to glory, so to speak, where the distillery has now gone from being able to produce 1.4 million liters of spirit to about 2 million liters of spirit. And then hopefully by the end of 2025, we'll be able to produce about 2.5 million liters of spirit at Ardbeg as well. There's now no longer any housing at the distillery other than 2 basically bed and breakfasts, which are for rent. So if you ever feel like making it out to Ardbeg distillery, please let me know and I'll do my best to set you up and have you stay at the distillery itself. A few weeks ago, we had the incredible Julie Reiner was out there, and Jillian Voice as well was out getting to see the distillery. A few weeks, actually, for Ardbeg Day, Neil Patrick Harris came out and stayed at the distillery as well. It's one of my absolute favorite places, and I can think of no better place to fall in love with Ardbeg than at each and every one of your bars, but then also sipping a whiskey out over that dock that I've mentioned quite a few times this afternoon. So thank you for letting me run through the presentation. Brittany, I'm ready for some of these heavy-hitting kind of hard questions here as well.
Well, it's funny that you just talked about the bed and breakfast, because one of those hard-hitting questions is, are there currently any programs for bartenders to experience the distillery?
That is a fantastic question, and I'm so glad that we are recording this so I can take that question up the ladder. Stateside, not currently. Stateside, not currently. It is quite difficult to take people on international trips without the expertise and help of wonderful organizations like Lush Life. So hopefully watch this space for next year. I'm fingers crossed that we'll be able to make something like that happen. There is a program in the UK that's run by our parent company, LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, that is called MH Assemblage. And that assemblage program, if you actually follow it on Instagram, they are very active on Instagram and work with some of the best and brightest up and coming and rising stars in the UK bar scene. So I did go out and accompany a few of those bartenders at Ardbeg, as well as on a trip to Champagne about a month and a half ago as well. So we're really hoping to fold some. I'm on the warpath to make sure that we fold some American bartenders into that program, or build a parallel path program ourselves to be able to take people to the distillery. Because myself, I fell in love with Ardbeg. I loved the whiskey already when I made my first trip out there. And then when I got to see the distillery and feel the distillery and walk around it, my heart never left. And, I end up working for them now for 4.5, 5 years. Yeah.
That's Cam's polite way of saying Brittany won't quit asking me when we're taking a group to Isla. So at some point, We will be, because I'm never going to shut up about it. I had a really great experience in Cognac with some of the assemblage bartenders. They were a part of the Hennessy My Way finalist trip, and I was able to bring over the U.S. finalist, and we got to hang out and go to Hennessy and go to Chateau Bagnolet, which is gorgeous. So the portfolio is doing it right. It's just a little trickier in the United States. We have a whole other set of liquor laws to navigate, but we're working on it. If Cam's on a warpath, it's probably because I won't quit.
I love it. Let's do it.
Excellent. Well, hopefully in the future, you'll see our faces on here telling you that we're going to be able to take a group. So once again, follow Cam at Ardbeg Cam. Stick around, stay tuned to the Portland Cocktail Week Instagram. As soon as we can confirm it, you will know about it because we'll be too excited to hide it. So, okay, with that very hard-hitting question, putting us all on the spot out of the way, I know that you talked about kind of the core range and Wee Beastie being the youngest there, but are there any current, former, or maybe future, if you can talk about that, marks that will be younger than Wee Beastie or tenure?
Yeah, should have known that this question would come from my good friend Graham here. Yes, so UK release only. We did not get this bottling here in the States. There is also an 8-year-old Ardbeg that you may find floating around. That was intended to be a UK release exclusively. I've seen a couple bottles make their way back here to the States by people who just are whiskey enthusiasts who have been able to purchase them over there. Without getting myself into trouble, I can say that there had been discussion of doing an 8-year-old. What was special about the 8-year-old that we bottled for the UK was that years ago, when we relaunched the distillery in 1997, some of the first whiskeys to come out of the distillery would have been quite iconic whiskeys from 1973, 74, and 77 are like the icon years of Ardbeg in the 70s. And then we relied on some whiskey that had been made actually by the team at Lafroig at Ardbeg Distillery. They used to pop over to the distillery to make sure that, it wouldn't fall into total disrepair. Remember, I told you that it's very communal kind of base. Everybody saw the value and they didn't want to let Ardbeg, slip into nothingness. So those would have been some of the first whiskeys to come out of the Ardbeg distillery. And then we, under Dr. Bill and, the distilling team at Ardbeg, found a new kind of like distillery thumbprint and identity. And so to reintroduce Ardbeg's chosen style to the Ardbeg committee and Ardbeg fans around the world, we went on this path that we called the Peated path to maturity. So it was Ardbeg very young, or it was Ardbeg very young, then Ardbeg very young for discussion, then Ardbeg still young, Ardbeg almost there, Ardbeg Renaissance, and then Ardbeg 10-year-old. So that's how we got all the way. That's how we got all the way up to having the Ardbeg to having Ardbeg 10-year-old as the bespoke and kind of keynote product that we make. And the for discussion tagline has popped up in Ardbeg's history multiple times because we release these whiskeys for our committee members to genuinely give us feedback and start discussion amongst themselves about the chosen course of the whiskey. So the 8-year-old product that we released in Europe was called Ardbeg 8 for discussion. And then rumor has it that there may be an 8-year-old that may at some point make its way here to the US as well.
And then we can discuss it. And by discuss, I mean drink it. So that sounds lovely. So this is kind of the last question pertaining to any specific expressions or marks in the line. So Kyle is framing this question in comparison to Bardstown Bourbon Company. So as they have been known to do with some of their products, is there any Ardbeg product that fuses multiple expressions into one bottle?
Yeah, absolutely. Roller coaster. Roller coaster would have been that from the earlier 2000s. Actually, on the back of Ardbeg roller coaster bottles, it tells you like what years it has distillate from, which was super cool. And then actually, if you want a more recent kind of foray into that space, Ardbeg NO, I would actually say is kind of the tethering of all of the different ideas from Ardbeg's core range, right? So you have the first, second, and third fill ex bourbon barrel aspect of the Ardbeg 10-year-old, right? So it's all ex bourbon cask and Ardbeg 10. That makes up about 60% of Ardbeg NO as well. Then you're going to have about 15 to 20% somewhere right in there. Dr. Bill likes to keep it a little confusing to throw people off the scent of his trail there. So getting a 100% answer from Dr. Bill is difficult at times, but as the world's foremost expert in whiskey distillation and maturation as well, he doesn't love when other people steal his mojo. So he tries to keep it a little bit, kind of top line, unless he has explicitly told us, don't repeat this, right? So for the sake of Ardbeg NO, 15 to 20% of that whiskey is wholly matured in sherry casks. But instead of being Pedro Jimenez, or instead of being Oloroso sherry casks, like you see in Wee Beast or Ugadal, it's actually Pedro Jimenez sherry cask, because that whiskey is supposed to be supple, almost a little fatty and a little round and fruity at the same time. So PX works really well there. And then very similarly to the idea of how he's used virgin oak in Corey Vrecken, instead of being virgin European oak or virgin French oak, it's actually the last 20% so odd right there is actually aged exclusively in virgin American oak. So he's taken a piece of the idea from each of the other each of the other four whiskeys in the core range, and he's kind of tied them all together there as well. So that would be our answer to that within our core range.
I imagine he probably has to have many decoys and false plots, because the Ardbeg fandom globally it's a lot like, I don't know, people who are trying to figure out Easter eggs and stuff in Taylor Swift albums or Marvel movies or things. People are always trying to figure out what Dr. Bill is going to be up to next. And I can't say I blame them. Anything he's up to, I feel great about. And Sophia had a question that I think is going to transition us nicely into Graham's next question. But I think this might be another idea for a class for round 3. More things about Isla: food, products, art, things just kind of a cultural overview. I think that could be, because I know that it's such a special place and there has to be so much to talk about, that probably just trying to answer it here wouldn't be all encompassing or give people a real insight into the sense of place. But that could also be a fun class. I would totally watch that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say something that's interesting about a couple things that are interesting on Isla. Let's tackle food first. Obviously, Scotland is a hotbed for haggis. The haggis on Isla is absolutely amazing. It's absolutely incredible. But the seafood is actually really the highlight on Isla, specifically the crab, the langoustines as well. The oysters. I'm a West Coast kid, so my preference is West Coast oysters. I like Kushis, Kumamotos, smaller, floral, a little bit more melon laden as well. But with the oysters that you'll find around Isla, they're absolutely massive. They're huge. They're absolutely huge. So I've got a funny story that I'll tell another time about watching one of my colleagues from South Africa have his first oyster ever, and it fought him back. Let's just say that. Yeah, it fought back with him. I would also say, some of the other interesting elements of Isla. Well, I mean, about 60 to 70% of the island in total is actually a peat bog in and of itself as well. So peat is pervasive as part of the culture as well there, not only limited to whiskey production. You actually smell it when you're walking through through the houses, which are, they do these like almost shotgun style houses that are made of brick, and you're walking through Port Ellen, and there are all these beautiful colors, pinks, blues, and whatnot. All the houses are extravagantly painted. And during the winter months, you'll actually smell peat-stoked fires inside every single person's home as well. And then, another product that they make on the island as well. There's now a rum distillery called the Isla Rum Company that sits directly across from Port Ellen Malting facility. And if you were to take a look at the back of their bottles, they actually remind me of Hampton Estates and Worthy Park, more so than Hampton Estate rum distillery, because they have double retort stills, the exact same still setup that Worthy Park utilizes as well over there. That's quite interesting. But one of the oldest industries on Isla is actually the textile industry. And there is a beautiful textile mill with an incredible loom that is powered by a river that runs through the island. And we visit most times that I'm there. Thankfully, this is being recorded. So when my bosses watch this, I can ask them, why have I not seen the custom-made jacket that was supposed to be made for me at the woolen mill as well there. Yeah, so not to throw anybody under the bus, but yeah, the mill on Isla it's called the Isla Woolen Mill, and it's absolutely stunning. It's amazing. Yeah.
I can't wait for your bosses to watch this episode, because it's just us being like, when are we going to do this? When are we getting this? So I'm sure they're going to really look forward to that. There's a very nice transition into Graham's question. And Joe, we're going to end with your question, because I feel like it is just it's the takeaway. It's the thing that people need to know. But Graham asked, why peat and Isla? Like, why are they so connected? And why is Isla the home of such heavily peated Scotch? And I think you already touched on that, but I wanted to bring it up in case you wanted to get a little deeper in there. But don't give away anything from future classes.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll dive into the style that is peated whiskey a little bit more in the next couple of weeks. But I would say that, historically, Isla has been the home of heavily peated whiskeys. Because about 20% of the UK in total is covered in peat moss and covered in peat banks as well. But specifically on Isla, like I had mentioned, almost 60 to 70% of the island is a living, breathing peat sink as well, and carbon sink and peat bog. So it has been the naturally occurring fuel source on the island for thousands of years now at this point. And a lot of that comes about because of deforestation during the Bronze Age as well. People have always said, well, there's no trees on Isla. Well, there were trees on Isla. They were a lot of them were cut down so that people could build their homes, so that people could use wood-stoked fires to cook their foods. And what started to happen is that there was kind of a waterlogging or a choking out of the remaining trees were choked out their root systems by an oversaturation. And then you had microflora and fauna that started to grow on top of each other year after year after year for millennia. And now you have what are effectively called like blanket bogs that cover most of the island. So effectively, they didn't stem from they're in peat. There are basically two different types of peat bogs. There are blanket bogs, and then there are raised bogs. So blanket bogs come about because they're not necessarily man-made, but they're influenced by humanity, right? It's basically like we amplified what was already going to happen naturally. Whereas then there's something called a raised bog, and raised bogs you'll oftentimes find in the highlands, the lowlands, and a little bit in Campbelltown as well. But those raised bogs are effectively like small water sources that were the result of the receding of like the the glaciers, right? So the polar ice caps. So as those glaciers started to recede, they left like divots in the earth. Those divots ended up being filled in by rainfall and also melting ice as well. And then you would have had like small like ferns and small shrubberies that would have grown up around the actual water source itself, basically choking out and stagnating it, making it a little bit more acidic, and then also propagating more growth of a lot of these smaller low-lying plant life, right? And so the raised bogs quite literally look almost like a little hill, like basically like a little hill, whereas a blanket bog almost covers basically the entire you could call it like the hillsides, right? So heavily peated whiskeys on Islay came about because there's this inextricable link between how people have lived on the island for thousands of years, utilizing this natural resource that they have in basically abundance.
Cool. So peat is to Islay kind of like limestone water is to Kentucky. Not the only place where it is. It's just they're using it because it's everywhere.
Exactly. That's a great analogy, actually. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to our last question before we give you all the last bits of info that you need before you carry on with your day. And that's from Joe. And I saved this for last because I know that there are so many fun things planned, but that everyone can also plan their own Ardbeg Day celebrations in the US. So Cam, tell us about some that are popular, really great, maybe like they're a really big deal in the community they're in, and how you can celebrate Ardbeg Day where you are in your heart and
Absolutely.
physically.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Ardbeg Day isn't only limited to celebration on June 1st. We actually celebrate Ardbeg Day throughout the entire month of June into July, and in some cases actually into August as well, because of the nature of distribution being difficult here in the States. For instance, I have an Ardbeg Day celebration coming up this weekend in Chicago. Where we're going to be doing a punk party at one of my favorite bars, which is called Delilah's in Chicago. It's a whiskey mecca bar. If you haven't been to it and you're in the Chicago area, make sure you stop by. I'll actually be there from 4 o'clock on Saturday until about 8. We'll do a couple of different whiskey tastings where we'll side by side the committee bottling, which is done at a little bit of a higher proof, and then the general release bottling, which is bottled at 46%. So we'll side by side those. We've got a band, a punk rock band that's actually doing an album release party at the same time. So we've kind of merged these two things. I can think of nothing more hardcore than listening to some punk rock, tasting whiskeys as well there. But if it's something you'd all like to do in your own markets and at your own bars as well, please feel free to shoot me a message. I travel. Most of the month of June is me either going to the distillery or going back and forth between different Ardbeg Day parties as, kind of a master of ceremonies and leading whiskey tastings. Some of the best events that we've done some killer ones in Northern California a few years ago when we did a whiskey that was called Ardbeg Drum. We partnered with one of my other favorite bars, which is called Rumba up here in Seattle, Washington as well. It's a very famous rum bar that we did a single malt Scotch whiskey party at as well, which was great. Our good friends down at the Highland Still House in Oregon City have been massive partners for us as well. And then we generally have a large Ardbeg Day celebration in New York City as well. And then, of course, because we live in a virtual world now, all of the Ardbeg Day celebrations that we do at the distillery are live streamed on the Ardbeg website and then live on the Ardbeg YouTube as well, as I had mentioned.
Also, if you message David Blackmore, and especially if you have an urgent question, he'll just send you a video of him partying on a boat for Ardbeg Day in response and never answer that question. So yep. You've got a lot of options. But if you do want to bring Ardbeg Day celebrations to your bar, and I think that's awesome because Ardbeg Day is super fun. Ardbeg is super delicious. If you aren't currently drinking or going to put an Ardbeg daiquiri on your menu, I'm sorry, but you are wrong. And it's a great way to spend more time with the brand who's made this all possible, right? DM Cam, even if he can't personally be there, there may be someone regionally from the team who can come and support you in your Ardbeg Day adventures. And with that, I think we got through all of the questions. So Cam, I know you red-eyed all the way to New York just to be there in time to do this class before you have, I'm sure, what is 1,000 meetings. Hopefully you're tasting Ardbeg in all of them. So I will go ahead and wrap this up for us because we're going to have a whole other one of these next week. So we have so much time to talk about Ardbeg Day, peat, giant oysters, all kinds of fun stuff. So with that, if you all enjoyed this class, please make sure you hit the like or love button and show some love in the comments. We appreciate you, Cam, for taking time out of your day to teach us all kinds of cool facts about Isla. And if you want to see more Portland Cocktail Week classes like this one, you can follow us here on Facebook or head over to YouTube if that's your preferred method at youtube.com/PDXCW. Once again, we have an Instagram. It's at PDXCW. Cam also has an Instagram. It's at Ardbeg Cam. Like I mentioned, our friend David Blackmore has an Instagram. He's on vacation with his family today, but DM him too. That is Glenmo Ardbeg David. Why not? Say hey to him. And then just want to remind you, if you're watching this and you're not currently in the certification program, there is an opportunity for you to get the Scotch Whisky Diploma from EWA, thanks to our friends at Ardbeg this year. If you go to pdxcw.com/Scotch and fill out your form before August 30th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern, we would be happy to consider your application. We'd love to have you. And one more thing I want to leave you with is that our friends at Glenmo and Ardbeg put together a super cool website with tons of info about both of the brands and a cocktail library where I know you all know how to make drinks, but like maybe your like mom or a friend or somebody wants a delicious Scotch cocktail at home and you have to work and they're not a bartender. Send them on over to Whiskey Spirit of Possibility. They can take a spin through that cocktail library, but you can go on there and learn a ton about Ardbeg and Glenmorangie. And with that, I hope you have the best Wednesday ever. I know I have been. So thank you all.
Cheers.